Is mold making you sick? Could it be the cause of your mystery autoimmune disease? Well, it was for me, and some experts estimate that 20% of the population could be struggling with mold toxicity and not even realize it. I recently figured out that mold was the cause of my chronic illness that I've been struggling with for the past 4 years, and I'm currently on an extensive treatment plan to get better. If you're new here, I have a degree in science, and I enjoy doing research on topics and reporting them.
Planet New Podcast.
This is the journey of setting yourself free.
So in this report, I'm going to go through my personal story, including how I figured out it was mold that was making me sick. And then I'm going to go into the science behind it. I explain what mold toxicity is and what CIRS is, chronic inflammation response syndrome, which is really tied to mold toxicity. I'm also going to go into what are the symptoms, what does it look like, and how to get diagnosed with mold toxicity. I also go into how to treat it with the Shoemaker Protocol and how to test your home for mold. At the end, I talk about how some experts and Jordan Peterson are calling it the asbestos of our generation because they think it's making so many people sick without us even realizing. I'm also going to talk about the link I found between autism and mold. So this is quite a detailed report. So I have chapter markers for each of these sections. So feel free to skip ahead. And if it looks like I'm reading something sometimes, it's because I'm reading a lot of this information directly from my blog. You can find all of the resources and reference for all my information on my blog. I'll put the link in my description. So first I'm going to go into my personal story. So my story starts in June 2020 when I moved into a small unit in Torquay, Australia, and that was built in the 70s, and there was no sign of mold in this house. Towards the end of the year, I started to develop some pretty significant health issues. I was bedridden with migraines. I had flu-like symptoms a lot of the time, and when I wasn't sick, when I would leave the house, I would get a flare-up of my symptoms and I would have to go home. So I stopped being able to work, exercise, go on holidays with my parents. I was constantly seeing doctors and specialists, constantly doing tests, which showed evidence of high inflammation. And the doctors told me that I had some kind of mystery autoimmune disease, but they didn't know what it was. So they diagnosed me with chronic fatigue. I was so scared during this time. I just felt like I was wasting my youth away. I had no idea what was wrong with me or how to get better. The doctors also really didn't know what was wrong with me, and sometimes I had to wait 6 months to see one. And this is the first time I saw the flaws in Australia's medical system. Even though I am grateful that it is better than other parts of the world, I still think it could be way better. The endocrinologist that I was seeing actually made a comment suggesting that I was lying about my fatigue and illnesses, but he was built like the man from the Minions, and I made a vow to myself that day that I would never take health advice again from someone who didn't look healthy. I also had a constant candida problem, and I was always thirsty and felt dehydrated, even though I drank so much water. At this time, I also went through a very severe depression, like really, really, really bad. Like it was so bad that sometimes it would just like whomp me like the whomping willow, and I just like could not get up off the floor. I remember one day I was walking from the couch to the kitchen to put a plate back or something, and it just hit me, and I just had to lay down there on the kitchen floor. And I think I was laying there for about 45 minutes until I could just get back up and go to the couch. Like that's how bad it was. It was really bad. I did have trauma that I hadn't dealt with, which I went to therapy for. But in hindsight, I honestly think that the mold amplified my depression like tenfold. I look back now and I'm like, imagine killing yourself over mold, but I 100% am sure that some people do. I had read before that depression can be a physiological problem rather than a mental one, and I didn't really believe that until I removed myself from the mold, and it dramatically improved my depression, like immediately. This is also a key sign for me that I'm in a mold environment that I can't see. Another symptom of mine is really chronic insomnia, which I've had since I was 16. I know now that is a symptom of my autism, which I'm going to talk about later, but it was definitely worse in the mold environment, and that's another sign to me that I'm in a moldy environment. I also want to mention that during this stage of my health journey, medicinal cannabis is one of the only things that was helping me with my migraines and some of my other symptoms, which is why I advocate for it. So in June 2021, when I was 28 years old, I moved back in with my parents and I stayed there for 2 years. And I got a lot better in this time, but it was slow progression. And I also gained like 20 kilos in this time for no apparent reason. And this is a big sign of mold toxicity. So the mycotoxins will affect leptin, the hormone, which is the hormone responsible for your hunger cues. So this causes people to eat more than they normally would. And the toxins from mold are also fat soluble. So your body will often create more fat, so it has some place to store these toxins away from the system. Also, mold can wreak havoc to your hormones, and correcting this is actually one of the key steps in treatment, according to the Shoemaker Protocol. And this likely caused my PCOS. And to anyone who has PCOS knows that just how much that messes with your weight. During this time, I was still struggling with depression, even though I had made leaps and bounds. And at this time, I tried the Lion Diet, which was developed by Michaela Peterson, who, if you haven't listened to this by some miracle, please come on my podcast. Even if it's just so I can thank you, because you've really pioneered a lot of the pathway towards my health and how I got better. And there's so many things I'd love to ask you, but even if you don't reach out and you happen to hear this, I'm just so grateful for what you've done, honestly. Um, yeah, so for those who don't know, the Lion Diet is the least allergy inducing diet. So it's basically the ultimate elimination diet. And so many people with autoimmune diseases have reported putting their conditions completely into remission on this diet. So it includes the meat of ruminant animals only. So for 6 weeks, I ate nothing but steak and lamb chops and salt. Nothing else, no oil, no spices, nothing. So I've literally done everything that I could to get better. And I'm going to do a report eventually on the Lion Diet as well. So this diet had a dramatic impact on me. I lost 10 kilos. I felt a lot better for the first time in 5 years. My blood tests showed no signs of inflammation, which is interesting to me because I obviously still had mold in my system, but it just must have been reduced so much that it wasn't in crazy range anymore. However, I still had fatigue, insomnia, and some other symptoms that it didn't fix. Interestingly, a lot of people in the carnivore community now believe that they actually have a problem with mold, and the carnivore diet simply reduced their bucket of inflammation so much that it stopped overflowing, and this caused a cessation of their symptoms. So, Judy Cho, she talks about this, and she's someone in the scene who I really trust to evaluate and report the science, while keeping an open mind enough to continuously update her opinion when new evidence is presented. So, Judy, you're another person who would absolutely love to talk to you on the podcast. Really look up to you. And yeah, so if you haven't read this or see this, then yeah, feel free to send me a message. So in July 2023, I moved into a new home by myself. So the house was originally built in the 70s, but it was completely renovated and it had an extension put on for the master bedroom and ensuite where I slept. So this house looked beautiful and modern. Again, there was no sign of mold. And in October 2023, I was diagnosed with autism. And I learned that many of my symptoms are related to that. So the insomnia is common as autistic people are wired to a different circadian rhythm, as is depression and chronic fatigue. So I learned that a lot of my chronic fatigue is actually autistic burnout. And so it's really common for people who have autism to have burnout because for us to process one day takes a lot more energy than a quote unquote normal person, particularly when it involves social interactions. But there is definitely a difference between burnout and chronic fatigue for me. And I just want to take a quick second to explain the difference between them for me. The best way I can describe burnout is like having two batteries. There is one day-to-day battery and there is the reserve battery. So if I do too much in one day, then I take from the reserve battery. But if I don't give myself enough downtime, that reserve battery doesn't refill. And when it's empty, I burn out. And it takes me a long time to recover it. Like I'm talking years. And some people never recover. The analogy that's given is that it's not just like you burn all the water from the kettle, you've actually burnt the kettle and now the kettle doesn't work well anymore, that being your body. So I just want to mention that because I just want to highlight that it's really important to not push autistic people to do things or have expectations on them that you would have on a normal person or a neurotypical person, because you can do some really irreversible damage to them. Chronic fatigue, on the other hand, is different because it's more of an inflammatory response. It often comes with flu-like symptoms, including the migraines. So I know now that my chronic fatigue is mold related for me. So in 2024, a whole new set of symptoms arose that I've never had before. And a lot of them were really acute issues that in themselves weren't enough to make me go to the doctor, but I knew that something was wrong. It was confusing because in some ways I was getting better and in other ways I was getting worse. So I now know that different types of mold will give me different symptoms. So my old symptoms of fatigue were getting better and I could run again, but yet a whole host of new symptoms appeared. I started to develop arthritis during certain periods whenever I would eat anything. So I did an IgG intolerance test and that told me that I was only intolerant to like 3 foods that I wasn't eating. So my naturopath later figured out that it was actually a histamine problem. It was foods that had high histamine, and histamine is really closely associated with mold. Then I started to get acne that I've never had before. I had itchy ear canals, ringing in the ears, blurry vision sometimes. I once broke out in a full body rash. I would always get night sweats and I would wake up with aches and stiffness in my shoulders, even though I didn't work out the day before. I had constant flare-ups of eczema. I couldn't breathe through my nose in bed at night. My sinus was always blocked, so I became a mouth breather and it was very uncomfortable. Then I was diagnosed with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Basically, my hormones were just whack. So then I started to notice impaired brain function. So I kept losing my train of thought, couldn't think of the word that I wanted to use, and my memory was getting worse. And I thought it was because I smoked weed. But then I don't smoke that much weed, and that never used to happen when I smoked weed. So yeah, and this has since stopped completely since moving into the tent. So my insomnia was also shocking at this time. It was pretty common for me to go to bed at midnight and still be laying there wide awake at 8 a.m. So usually it takes me 3 to 4 hours to fall asleep on a good night, but not 8. This was next level. I was also having really bad bouts of depression, which was confusing because I was in remission for depression, but some days I would just have really strong suicidal ideation and I had no idea why because nothing was wrong. Then I started to develop a compromised immune system, and this was the breaking point for me. So I used to be the type of person who could get sick once a year, and then I started to get sick once every month. And by sick, I mean I caught whatever was going around and I was out for a week, like couldn't get out of the house for a week, like that level of sick. And then it started to be once every second week. So 1 week on, 1 week off, 1 week sick, 1 week not. And I was freaking out because I was like, I can't go back to being sick like this all the time. This is when I finally figured out that it was mold that was making me sick. I left the house, I moved into a tent in my parents' backyard, and almost all of these symptoms have stopped dramatically since then. Okay, so how did I figure out that it was mold? So I couldn't see mold in any of my houses that I've lived in that have made me sick. But in the last house, I intuitively knew that it was something in the air that was causing my eczema because my symptoms were worse in some rooms and better than in others. I also knew that dust had caused my eczema in the past. And this is interesting because it turns out that dust is highly associated with mold as the mycotoxins attach to dust. And this explains why I always flare up when I go to op shops and places like that. So I bought an air purifier, but the purifier kept saying that the air was clean. So that was confusing. Then one day I opened Instagram for one of the first times since taking a long break from it. And the first thing I saw was a post from my friend Janelle about how she just realized that mold was making her family sick, and in particular her son who was in hospital. And I just want to say a quick thank you to Janelle because if you weren't open about your story, then I wouldn't have figured that out. So thank you. I can't explain it, but when I saw that post, it just went straight through me. And it was like something in me was saying pay attention. So this is when I started to think maybe it was mold. I was also aware that one of the walls in my bedroom underneath the window where I slept my head at night, that used to leak in really, really heavy rain. So for those who don't know, mold grows in water damaged buildings. So, if there's a flood or there's a leak, you have 24 to 48 hours to dry that space professionally with, professional dehumidifiers or else mold will grow. So then I started to put the pieces together. So I bought a moisture meter, but all the readings came back 0.0. But I probably bought the wrong one. There's some good ones and there's some shit ones. I'm going to make a recommendation for a good one in Australia in the how to test your home for mold section later. So all the evidence, the air purifier was saying that the air was clean. The moisture meter was saying 0.0. So I thought, I don't know if it can be mold if I can't see anything. Then a week later, I was meditating and I said to the universe, like I always do, please give me some guidance for my next few steps. And as soon as I said that, the image of Janelle's post, popped straight into my mind. And that shit doesn't happen to me. I'm not a psychic or whatever. I don't know, something was so strongly saying to me mold, mold. When I started going down the rabbit hole with mold toxicity, everything inside me just went click, 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 click. And I just knew in my heart and soul that this is what was making me sick. However, I couldn't see any mold and I had no evidence, I hadn't done any tests or anything yet. So I was really, really scared that people weren't going to believe me. This is a big problem with people with mold toxicity is you can be really gaslit. A lot of people will treat you like you're paranoid or you're crazy because they can't see it and you don't have any evidence yet. And, everywhere you go, you can be like, is it mold? Is it mold? And you don't know. Then I looked very carefully on the walls in my house for mold and I couldn't see it. But then I finally spotted some in my ensuite. There were tiny spots that you couldn't see unless you were looking for it. And that was it. I was out. I took my cat to my parents' house and I never stayed in that house again. I moved into a tent in their backyard where I'm still living 3 months later. I told the real estate because I was renting, and by law, they have to send someone within 2 days to look at it. So they sent a mold inspector who tested several places, including the leaking wall where you couldn't see any mold, and they all came back positive. So they said they would send someone to fix it, but that it would take 3 weeks. And so I asked them on the phone several times, the real estate agent, I was just like, is this house safe for me to stay in or not? And they kept saying, we can't tell you that. And so I broke up with them. I was just like, well, fuck you then. I'm breaking the lease. According to VCAP, if you have mold in your house, you're allowed to leave or break the lease without there being any penalties, such as them taking your bond. So this is what I did. But they ended up fucking me over anyways by taking $1,000 out of my bond because of quote unquote dust on the light fittings, even though I sent them an invoice for a professional cleaner. So they just started doing petty shit like that. And it's don't worry about the thousands of dollars literally me and my family have spent on medical bills and having to throw out so much of my furniture, whatever. And I actually went through a phase where I was just like so angry about all of that. And I don't know, there's just something about when a person disrespects you and gets away with it. And I thought I was going to come on here on my podcast and like name and shame them. And I wouldn't even be against people who do that. But for me, I went through like a bit of a stage of processing like resentment. And I'm actually going to do another podcast about that in the future. But so I've decided not to do that. So after that, I started to focus on getting better. I researched and I found 2 specialist doctors in Australia, highly regarded, including Dr. Kate Barry, who will be in a future podcast episode. And Dr. Barry referred me to get a whole heap of tests done, and the results did indeed confirm that I had mold toxicity. I will go into more detail about that below. I've also been taking prescription medication, and I have noticed improvements. But because all of this was costing my family so much money, I decided to move to Dr. Anjana's clinic just because she works closely with a naturopath, Adrian Harper. And so I see a combination of both of them, and this helps to keep the costs down a lot. I will say that the process of getting better can be really hard because a lot of doctors don't know anything about it. And so many of them will just dismiss it completely and call it woo-woo. If you're in Geelong, I really recommend Dr. James Webster at Myers Street Medical. Even though he's not a specialist in mold, he's just supportive and he's open-minded. And so he's someone that I'm really grateful I had on my team during this time. But the best thing that you can do is go to a specialist doctor because 1, they will understand, 2, they will validate how you're feeling, and 3, they'll put you on the right path. Okay, so the report. Let's go into what is mold toxicity and what is CIRS, chronic inflammation response syndrome, as this is really closely linked to mold toxicity. So first I'm going to start with how do you spell mold? I see this all the time. So it's spelled MOULD in the UK British English that we use here in Australia, and it's spelled MOLD in American English. So mold is a type of fungus that can make toxins called mycotoxins. These mycotoxins can enter our body if we inhale spores into our lungs, or absorb the toxins through our skin, or ingest them through contaminated food. For a normal person, once the toxins enter the body, the immune system recognizes them and creates the antibodies to take the toxins out of the system. However, 25% of the population have a gene that means that their body can't create the antibodies, and so the toxins get stuck in the system and circle around and around until you take medication to manually bind to the toxins and take them out of your body. So someone with that gene, instead of creating antibodies, the body produces cytokines, which set off a profound inflammatory response. So this condition is called CIRS, chronic inflammation response syndrome. And this is why if you take a person with mold illness out of the mold environment, they still remain sick. It's because the mold is stuck in their body and their body can't create the antibodies to take it out. So this is why many people with mold illness often have autoimmune diseases or chronic fatigue syndrome. The body is stuck in a perpetual inflammatory response that eventually becomes dysregulated. So this kicks off the biotoxin pathway as developed by Dr. Shoemaker, who is the leading doctor and researcher in this field. So the flood of cytokines, it blocks leptin receptors, which, to put short, means that mold toxicity can affect many areas of the body, including immune regulation, hormonal balance, brain and nerve function. The Shoemaker Protocol is a treatment plan for treating CIRS and mold toxicity, and it corrects each of these systems and markers that are disrupted by mold. So I'm going to go into this in more detail later, but this is why many people suffering with mold have a confusing array of symptoms. It's because mold illness is considered a multi-system, multi-symptom condition. So this means that mold will affect multiple systems in your body, such as the digestive system, the respiratory system, etc. And of those systems, you can have multiple symptoms, such as abdominal pain, IBS, developing intolerances to foods that you could once tolerate, etc. So, and this is also why it looks so different in different people, because some people can have a whole host of different symptoms than another person. Symptoms. Okay, as mentioned above, symptoms can be multi-system and multi-symptom. So mold illness can be hard to diagnose because 2 people living in the same house can have completely different symptoms, making it really difficult to pinpoint mold. And this is more exacerbated when one person has the gene and the other doesn't, because one person may be getting chronically sick while the other person only gets a blocked sinus. So this causes them to rule out environment. The following is the list of symptoms commonly experienced with mold toxicity, and it's taken from Dr. Jill Krista's book, Break the Mold. So as you will see, there are a lot, and each symptom from each category is worth different points that tell you to give you an indication if mold toxicity is your problem. It's quite detailed, so for more information, I really recommend just going to her website, which I have put on my blog. So category 1, brain fog, feeling tired all the time, frequent runny nose, blowing your nose often, sneezing, sinusitis, postnasal droop, nosebleeds, swollen glands, shortness of breath, frequent yawning or sighing, heart palpitations, headaches, hay fever, eye irritation, blurry vision, frequent changes in vision, allergies, dark circles under eyes, sensitivity to sunlight, nervousness / can't settle down, low mood or depressed, feeling overwhelmed, episodic / chronic dry cough, irritated lungs, blood-streaked mucus, nasal polyps, coated tongue, sores in the mouth, bumps on the back of the throat, thrush, sore or itchy ear canals, ringing in the ears, bothered by loud noises, skin rash, burning or itchy skin, easy bruising, spider veins, bothered by tags and seams on clothing, anemia, protruding veins on limbs, lower extremity edema, clear your throat often, sore throat, frequent colds, delayed recovery from colds, exhausted from exercise, frequent static shocks, increased thirst, trouble sleeping, feeling of internal vibration, dizziness, vertigo, drunken feeling, frequent urination, yeast infection, changes in appetite, intestinal gas, nausea, feeling bloated, constipation, crave sweets, crave alcohol. So yeah, that's a lot. And as you can see, a lot of my really random but specific symptoms like itchy ear canals, it all makes sense. Okay, so category 2, wheezing, asthma, burnt lungs, recurrent respiratory infections, migraine, allergies that aren't well controlled by medication, voice sounds nasally, plugged or clogged ears, chronic sinusitis, vomiting, alternating constipation / diarrhea, irritable bowel, food sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, abnormal reaction to antibiotics, Epstein-Barr virus, recurrent yeast infections, bacterial vaginosis, recurrent athlete's foot, jock itch, or toenail fungus, peeling / slouching skin, episodes of fast heart rate, chest pain, Raynaud's syndrome, non-obstructive sleep apnea, difficulty thinking clearly, disorientation, balance issues, slow reflexes, incoordination, numbness or tingling, nerve pains, unexplained menstrual changes, overactive bladder, bladder infection, react to musty spaces. Category 3 has a lot of conditions that I honestly can't pronounce. So, check out her website or my blog, but I'm also dyslexic. Remember the autism, so I'm doing my best. So, daily use of sinus spray, sinus prescription or neti pot, sinus surgery at any time in your life, chronic inflammatory response syndrome or CIRS, mark-ons, peanut allergy, chronic fatigue syndrome, difficulty walking, POTS, PANS, hearing loss, confusion, dementia, memory loss, tremors, sarcoidosis, asthma that's difficult to control with medication, idiopathic pneumonitis, lung scarring or nodules, respiratory distress, histamine intolerance, ulcer, non-celiac intestinal disease, blood in stool, cyclic vomiting syndrome, liver pain or swelling, fatty liver, NASH, kidney pain or swelling, kidney disease, chronic pelvic pain, infertility, previous or current cancer diagnosis, mast cell activation syndrome, exposure to water-damaged buildings at any time in your life, exposure to mould, or a positive Shoemaker test. I'm also going to go into CIRS below, and there's certain symptoms that are specifically associated with CIRS, particularly in categories or clusters. Okay, so diagnosing mold toxicity. How do you actually get diagnosed? So this can be difficult as many doctors are still ignorant when it comes to mold toxicity, and some will write it off completely. Because you can't see mold, it's easy to think that it's all in your head and that you're being paranoid. I think everyone with CIRS has been there, but there are tests that you can do, so just trust the process. I would highly recommend seeing a specialist mold doctor as they will believe you. You can see many online, telehealth, and they will know exactly what to test for and how to treat it. Okay, so the HLA-DR gene test. So probably the first thing you want to do is get the HLA-DR gene test. So make sure you don't get the celiac one. But 25% of the population have this gene, and it makes them more susceptible to mold poisoning. So that's not even that's 1 in 4. It's not like a crazy small number of people. It's 1 in 4 people have this gene. So it costs about $200, or it can be bulk billed in Australia. So the test results usually take about 10 business days to come back, and you may need to get a specialist doctor to interpret the results. My GP couldn't do it. It's pretty confusing. There is a website that allows you to calculate your results in Australian format. And if that fails, there is a paper by Shoemaker that you can use. I put both of these links on my website, which is in the description. So the gene can test positive for mold susceptible or multi-susceptible. So a person who tests positive for multi-susceptible, it means you're susceptible to multiple threats, including mold, ticks, E. coli, and more. This is the gene that I tested positive for. I also tested positive for the chronic fatigue susceptible gene, which I didn't even know that was a thing, but that was very validating considering I have chronic fatigue. Separate to the gene test is mold allergy test. So even if you don't have the gene, you could have a mold allergy, an IgA, or a mold intolerance, IgG, which both are detected through a normal blood test and can be bulk billed. Visual VCS test. So another test you can do online and at home is the visual VCS test. So this test is good because it will give you a good indication immediately and for free online. So as the mycotoxins from mold can cross the blood-brain barrier, mold affects brain function. So this explains the symptoms of memory loss, poor concentration, losing my train of thought. It also affects contrast visibility. And so almost all people with mold poisoning fail this test. So the patient looks at a series of alternating white and black lines, and if they can't see them, this indicates poor retinal function, which is closely linked to biotoxicity. It sounds simple, but in the field, it's widely accepted. Okay, microtoxin urine test. There is some debate about using this test. So this test screens for many different types of microtoxins, and it can be useful if you need to prove to someone that mold is in your system, such as a landlord or a boss. It costs about $400 in Australia through Nutripath, and some doctors like it because it can show you exactly what types of mold are in your system and making you sick, and then you can target them for treatment. Dr. Neil Nathan talks about this in his book Toxic. I really recommend this book. It's probably my favorite. But he says that different types of binders will bind better to different types of mold. So if you know exactly what type of mold you're sick with, you can, then curate your treatment plan and use this binder to treat it more specifically. However, some doctors don't bother with this test because it's so expensive. They believe that this money is better spent on treatment, and there's other things you can do to confirm that you have more toxicity. The test can also be inaccurate and it doesn't screen for every type of mycotoxin. And also, some patients seriously compromise the ability to remove toxins from their body, which means that the test can come back as negative, even if it's truly positive. So to combat this, Dr. Neil Nathan suggests that patients should take 500 milligrams of glutathione, hope I've said that right, twice a day for a week leading up to the test, and then doing a urine sample 30 minutes after a sauna. I went down the path of not getting the test. I thought it was better to spend that money on, the treatment. Okay, blood tests. So Dr. Shoemaker suggests testing for the inflammatory markers that usually go array when dealing with mold toxicity. So these include VIP, MSH, leptin, and more. There are other tests that can indicate mold illness, including a full blood count, liver function, lipid profile, immune markers, and many, many more. But this is way out of my league. You should talk to a specialist doctor about this. I'm going to have Dr. Kate Barry on my podcast, so listen to that. Okay, CIRS, chronic inflammation response syndrome. So when I talk about getting diagnosed with CIRS, I'm going to say diagnosed with inverted commas because you can't technically be diagnosed with CIRS in Australia. And this is because it's not widely recognised as a formal medical diagnosis yet by mainstream healthcare systems. However, specialist doctors will likely tell you that you have it and continue to treat you for it. So the best way to see if you have CIRS is to do the visual VCS test and then look at the clusters of symptoms. So as I mentioned previously, mold can cause multiple symptoms in multiple systems of the body. So if you have symptoms from 8 of the 13 clusters, then there is a 95% chance that you have CIRS. If you have symptoms and fail the visual VCS test, there is a 98.5% chance that you have CIRS. The different clusters test to see if you have symptoms from multiple systems. So I'm going to go now through these clusters and list the symptoms. Cluster 1, fatigue. Cluster 2, weakness, decreased assimilation of new knowledge, aches, headaches, light sensitivity. Cluster 3, memory impairment, decreased word finding. Cluster 4, difficulty concentrating. Cluster 5, joint pain, AM stiffness, cramps. Cluster 6, unusual skin sensitivity, tingling. Cluster 7, shortness of breath, sinus congestion. Cluster 8, cough, excessive thirst, confusion. Cluster 9, appetite swings, difficulty regulating body temperature, increased urination frequency. Cluster 10, red eyes, blurred vision, night sweat, mood swings, ice pick pain. Cluster 11, abdominal pain, diarrhea, numbness. Cluster 12, tearing of the eyes, disorientation, metallic taste. Cluster 13, static shocks and vertigo. So don't ask me what ice pick pain is. I have no idea what that is. But as you can see again, like a lot of my really weird specific symptoms fit perfectly into these categories. So if you don't have symptoms from at least 8 of these clusters, then you can still be sick from mold, but you just probably don't have CIRS. And that's something really important to know. Like even if you don't have the gene, you can still get really sick from mold. You just won't get as sick and it won't take you as long to recover. So 95% of people with CIRS do have the HLA-DR gene. However, there is a small chance that you can have CIRS even if you test negative to the gene. According to Dr. Kate Barry, she's noticed that 5% of the people who don't have the gene usually have a high level of MSH. So, if you like feel pretty in your heart that like mold is making you sick, it can be making you sick even if you test negative for the gene. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay, treatment for CIRS and mold toxicity. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Shoemaker Protocol. So the Shoemaker Protocol is a medical framework developed by Dr. Richie Shoemaker for treating CIRS and mold toxicity. Based in the United States, he began his research after identifying a link between mold exposure and chronic illness in patients. He's responsible for progressing the field with publishing several scientific studies on the topic, which I've put some in my blog. The protocol focuses on identifying and addressing the root cause of inflammation with a step-by-step process, which I'll go through now. Please note that not every doctor will follow the protocol exactly, and treatment plan will differ per individual. So please also note that the timeframe for healing from mold varies dramatically per person, depending on how badly you were exposed and how sensitive you are. So the timeframe given is often between 6 months to 5 years, and some people report never returning to full health. However, it is hard to know if these people were ever truly removed from the moldy environment. But in general, like there is hope. CIRS really is treatable, and yeah, you can get hope of getting your health back eventually. So the following information is taken directly from Dr. Shoemaker's website, survivingmold.com. 1. Removal from ongoing exposure. So obviously this means the first thing you've got to do is get out of the moldy environment. Now this is easier said than done, as first it can be hard to pinpoint exactly where is the mold coming from. Is it coming from your home? Is it coming from work? Is it coming from school? And if it is coming from like your home, how do you break a lease? Like, where do you go? Like, a lot of people don't have simple answers to these questions. So first you got to pinpoint it and then get out of there. I moved into a tent in my parents' backyard and that's working really well for me. So yeah. Step 2, treat with cholestyramine or other binders. So I'm going to go into the binders now. So the main way to treat mold illness is with binder medication. So as mentioned earlier, if you have CIRS, your immune system can't remove mycotoxins. It will try to remove them through bile, which it releases into the intestines, but it will get reabsorbed into your body through the digestive tract. So the binders work by binding to the toxin more strongly than the toxin binds to bile. And so then it is excreted via stool. So this is why it's important to ensure that you're maintaining regular bowel movements while you're taking binders, because if you're not excreting it, it can cause the toxins to reabsorb into your body. There are many different binders that you can use, but the best one is a prescription called cholestyramine. It is often used to lower cholesterol, but it is considered the best binder because it's similar size and the opposite charge to the toxins, causing it to bind really well with it. However, as I said earlier, different mycotoxins can bind best with different binders. So there are some natural binders, such as activated charcoal, clay, and I even know someone who's used steamed kale as a binder. But I just went straight to the hard stuff. I really want to just get this out of my body. So I use Question Light, which is still cholestyramine, but with different fillers. And this version is significantly cheaper than the compound or pure version of cholestyramine. Question Light is $44 for a pack of 50 sachets in Australia, while the compound version is roughly $300. So for those who don't know, a compound pharmacy is where they have a lab at the pharmacy and they make the drug in the lab on site. And so this is why it's a bit more expensive. But some people are really sensitive and they can't handle the fillers that are in Question Light, so they have to get the compound version. Mold toxicity is really closely linked to multiple chemical sensitivity. So it's actually really common for patients of mold toxicity to be extremely sensitive to medications. And so it's not uncommon for people to have to start with like 1/16th of like the normal dose or even less. Dr. Neil Nathan talks about this a lot in his book Toxic. So really recommend that if that's you. Other people also are a bit iffy with Question Light because it contains the sweetener aspartame, which some speculate is associated with cancer. So I'm actually taking a mixture of 3 binders. I'm taking cholestyramine, clay, and one that's from a brand called Cellcore. However, be careful with anything you take, as citric acid is often derived from black mold and is in a lot of products, so you have to be really careful. Okay, so reactions. It's actually really common for people to have really bad symptoms when taking binders. So, if a reaction appears to be an exasperation of your current symptoms, it indicates that the binder has pulled the toxins into your body faster than their compromised detoxification systems can clear them. So, basically, what this means is that the binders have gone into your body, they're taking the toxins out of your system and they bring them up to the surface to excrete them. However, sometimes we have blocked detox pathways, and so they can't get out, and this causes you to have a heap of symptoms. Pushing through this does not make you heal faster. It's really bad to push through things. It'll make things worse and set you back. So if you're taking binders and you're having bad symptoms, back off, back off the dose. I'm going to go into detox pathways. So, binding is only half the story because once the binders pull the toxins out of your system, you then have to detox them out of your body. However, the toxins themselves often poison the very systems needed to remove these toxins, such as the lymphatic, the kidneys, etc. So, as a result, it's really common for mold patients to have reactions to binders as the medication brings these toxins to the surface, but they have no place to go. So, it's really important for patients to optimize the drainage pathways. The best way to do this is to sweat. So, exercise is good if tolerated, and so is going to the sauna. So I'm currently going to the sauna somewhere between 3 to 5 times a week. Other methods include dry brushing and rebound trampolining, which is just jumping on a little trampoline every day, as these will stimulate the lymphatic drainage system. So, I did experience this. I experienced really, really bad flare ups of chronic fatigue, and they just left me absolutely bedridden and worse than I've had in years. And also some pretty bad bouts of depression. And it was pretty scary, to be honest. It's like I had a mental flashback of where I was at that place. So for me, my mistake was I increased my binder dose too quickly. I started on half a sachet in the morning and half at night. Then I quickly went up to like one in the morning, one at night, one and a half, two, two and a half, three, which is like six in total. And it was just way too much. It was silly. I did all that in like a week. So, but I'm pretty headstrong sometimes. I'm like, I just want to get better. Yeah, big mistake. Okay, so step 3, treat mark-ons. So mark-ons are a group of bacteria that can colonize in the nasal passages, and they're often resistant to antibiotic use. So they're very common in people with mold toxicity, and they actually contribute to worsening the symptoms. They can cause an increase in cytokines in the body. So this worsens the immune response, it destroys MSH function, and they make thick layers of biofilm, which protect the bacteria, which means it's hard for you to actually get them and get them out of your body. So the presence of mark-ons is detected through a nasal swab test, which is $200 in Australia through Nutripath. It's one of those tests where they, put the swab right at the back of your brain, and, like tickle it. I tested positive with a quote severe overgrowth, and that explains why I can't breathe through my nostrils and have to mouth breathe at night, from my understanding. So my treatment protocol includes saline irrigation daily, and now I do that flush with a herbal solution as well. And if it's still present after 8 weeks, I will have to try antibiotics if I can. Okay, so the next steps, 4 to 11, I'm actually just going to skip them because they're really technical and I actually can't pretend that I fully understand them. But basically, I have the information on my blog though, if you do want more detail. But basically, mold will disrupt all these different systems in your body. And basically, steps 4 to 11 is you treating these individual systems. And, there's easy markers that you can do blood tests for to actually see how they've been affected, which is how you can get diagnosed and how you are responding to treatment. So, this includes correct anti-gliadin antibodies, correct androgen levels, which is the sex hormones, which is how mold affects your hormones, correct ADH. So this is why people get a lot of static shocks when they have more toxicity. It's because there's a problem with like the osmosis with like your, I think it's like your electrolytes or your ions with your water. So, there's dysregulation in that, which is really interesting. Correct MMP-9 levels, correct VEGF, correct C3A, correct C4A, TGFB1, and BIP. Sorry, there's 12 steps. So, and a lot of these steps are really interestingly related to fatigue. So I'm excited to go through these steps. Okay, how to test your home for mold. So like I keep saying, you can't always see mold. In fact, the 3 houses that made me sick, I could not see mold at all, except for those tiny spots I finally saw in the ensuite. So according to Dr. Shoemaker, there is no one type of house that is more likely to be moldy than others. So while older houses have more time to be water damaged, some modern houses aren't really built that well. So the house that I lived in, the last one, was a new renovation, but it had a flat roof, so poor drainage. So like I said earlier, if there is some kind of leak or flooding, it has to be dried professionally with dehumidifiers within 24 to 48 hours or mold will grow. So the quickest and easiest way is to get an ERMI test. So ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. Basically what this test does, it's like a cloth and you wipe it over a dusty sample, surface sample. This could be the top of like a ceiling fan, and then you send it to a lab. And this test measures the concentration of harmful mold species in the dust sample. So it's relatively cheap and quick. I think the turnaround time is about a week. So this is a really good option for testing potential rental homes, or even if you want to buy a home, you need to know quickly, is there mold in this house? It's a good way to go about it. However, it doesn't tell you much more than if mold is present. Moisture meter. So moisture meters can be important because they can show you evidence of water damage, which is obviously linked to mold. However, you have to get the right moisture meter. Some are shit and it doesn't give you the whole story either. So I spoke to Jess from Moldwise. She's a really, really great mold inspector in Australia who has suffered from CIRS. So she gets how serious you have to take it. She's also agreed to be on my podcast in a future episode. But she sent me a recommendation for one that she has heard is like a really decent one you can get from Bunnings for $50. But yeah, she says she hasn't tested it herself. Okay, mold inspector. So obviously, if you think you have mold, you can get a mold inspector, but be warned, if you want to get your house tested for mold, you have to be very, very careful in Australia. There are no guidelines, and some companies work closely with insurance companies and landlords, and they want to say that nothing is wrong because obviously remediation can mean tearing down walls. Full renovation can cost thousands of dollars, if not hundreds. So some companies do have their best intentions, but if they haven't had CIRS and mold toxicity, they honestly don't know how serious they need to take it. So what is fine for a normal person is not fine for a person with CIRS. So a good inspector will inspect the entire house. They will walk around the perimeter, suss out drainage, ask about the house history, do thermal testing, as well as surface samples and air samples. They will take air samples both inside of the house and outside so they can compare them. And they will advise you to keep all windows and doors closed for 48 hours prior to testing. If they don't do these things, that's an indication they're probably not the best mold inspector. The best thing you can do is probably get a building biologist most of the time. Doesn't have to be, but a lot of them are pretty good. Expect to pay anywhere from $1,000 up, depending on the size of your house. I know it's a lot of money, but unfortunately, if you have CIRS, you don't really have a choice. I know someone who paid a mold inspector $26,000 to remediate her house, only to still be getting symptoms. So she hired a building biologist, and almost every room in her house came back a red zone. So, it's not worth cutting corners. For context, when I was looking at getting my parents' house tested, an inspector told me that insurance should send a hygienist for free if someone in the house has the gene. And so we called our insurance and they actually honored that. So they came and did the test. It was like a 20-year-old guy. He had no idea what he was doing, to be perfectly honest with you. He didn't tell us to lock up the house beforehand. He was asking me, like, where do you think I should do the surface sample? I'm like, bro, you're the expert. Like, anyway, the report came back and it said that nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. But I was having symptoms. So I knew. So I sent the report to Jess from Moldwise. I paid Jess $150 to look over the report, which is the service that she offers. And yeah, she said there's a lot of red flags here, including like did test positive for 2 types of mold. So then I contacted MJ from MJ Building Biology. The link to all these people is on my blog, which is in the description. And she looked over my parents' house and she found several problems. So, including one red zone, which was the room that was next to the bedroom that I was sleeping in, like when I tried to sleep in the house for a short period of time. And you can't see mold in any of these walls in this room. So, it's really difficult to get the right people. Like my advice, honestly, is to just don't cut corners. Expect to pay a bit of money up front, but it's better to do that at the start than have to just fuck around and just have to pay even more later. Okay, renting. If you are renting, report the mold to the real estate. So I don't know the laws for all the different states in Australia, but according to VCAT, which is the Victorian Tribunal which resolves disputes between landlords and renters, in Victoria, they have to do something about it within 2 business days, or you can basically sue them for everything, including medical costs, replacing furniture, 25% of your rent from the day that you reported, etc. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't take this seriously and landlords are hesitant to because remediation can be very expensive. So if mold is detected, in Victoria, you are allowed to break the lease without any penalties. E.g., they can't keep your bond, which I stated earlier. But the hard thing with, renting is that because there's no guidelines, they kind of don't have to take it as seriously as they need to yet. Hopefully in 10, 20 years this changes. It's really, really hard. But if there is like really obvious mold and they're not taking it serious, you can sue them. But it's really hard. unlucky that I was in a position where I have a good relationship with my parents and they let me live in a tent in their backyard. But if you can do something like that, it sounds shit, but being healthy is worth it. Okay, remediation. What does the remediation process looks like? So remediation must be done by a professional. So remediation can involve replacing plaster, scratching mold out of the wooden frames of the house, vacuuming mold from areas with professional equipment. So, this can be very expensive. A lot of this has to be done by professionals. So other areas that need to be remediated often includes air conditioners. So air conditioners are a breeding ground for mold and they have to be professionally cleaned by a specialist twice a year if you have CIRS. Furniture. If you have porous furniture, I think couches, you have to throw it away. Unfortunately, these are ones that can't be cleaned if they're contaminated. If they've been in a moldy house and you want to move to a new house, it's just not worth taking it. I know this is really hard to hear, but so many people talk about contaminating their new home by bringing furniture from the old home. So it depends on how sensitive you are as well. Wood is also considered bad unless it's sealed, and mattresses are another one that have to go. So I sold a lot of my furniture just to be sure, and I threw away my mattress. And yeah, I later discovered that even my makeup brushes were moldy. So the mold spores do travel and, contaminate. Clothing. So if you can visibly see mold on your clothes, you have to throw it. Otherwise, you should wash everything 4 times with different additives each time, according to the Shoemaker Protocol. So, look, the best place, if you want more information on all of this, I really recommend Dr. Shoemaker's website, survivingmold.com. Also put that on my blog, but that's the best place to go for all this information. So, I had to wash every single item of clothing that I owned, which cost me like $300 at the laundromat. And I ruined one of my favorite jumpers. And to be honest with you, that was the first time this whole thing really broke me. That was the first time I was really, really upset about everything. I was pretty positive about everything until then because I was happy that I knew what was making me sick. But yeah, I don't know, um, yeah, that's when I started to get angry. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some short little things that I've come across when going down the rabbit hole. Asbestos of our generation. So we are currently experiencing an epidemic of chronic illness in our culture, particularly when it comes to autoimmune diseases. So it's a real possibility that we're all suffering from mold illness and we don't even realize. So many people, including Jordan Peterson, who has explored this on his podcast episode, also linked on my blog, in an episode with Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Mann, have called mold the asbestos of our generation. And what they mean by that is that they think that we could be living in extremely dangerous housing without even realizing it. So earlier I said that as much as 20% of the population could be sick from mold. So this is where this estimate comes from. If 25% of the population had this gene that makes them more susceptible to getting sick from mold, and an estimated of 30 to 80% of buildings have water damage, then it's possible that 20% of the population could be sick from mold right now. So this can range from severe autoimmune diseases to just the aches and pains that you thought came with getting old. So this actually gave me so much hope because I always say that we need a revolution of healing. Heal yourself, heal the world. And I think physical healing is synonymous with spiritual healing. And so I have extreme hope that over the next 10 years, as this becomes more apparent and widespread knowledge, that we will have an epidemic of healing in our culture. Linked to autism. So it hasn't crossed my awareness that there appears to be a link between autism and mold toxicity. So many of the symptoms that I previously mentioned, like chronic fatigue, insomnia, depression, they overlap with autism, but there are also neurological symptoms too. So this includes a lack of concentration, increased sensitivity to stimuli, including light, sensitivity to tags on clothing. A lot of these are really closely linked with autism as well. So as I said earlier, mycotoxins affect brain function as they are small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. So many people who experience mold illness, they actually incorrectly get diagnosed with ADHD or even autism sometimes. So I want to take a moment to say that I personally do not think that my autism was caused by mold, but I definitely do believe that it amplifies my neurodivergent symptoms. I think it amplifies my insomnia, my depression, lack of concentration, things like that. So my theory is that majority of the autistic population, or perhaps just the female autistic population, could have the HLA-DR gene and have been exposed to mold. So I think this could explain the strong link between autistic people and chronic fatigue. I've also found several studies, which are on my blog, that suggest that people with autism are more susceptible to mold toxicity. So this could be one theory as to why. So autism is also linked to inflammation. And so I believe that mold could be a huge part of the puzzle in treating autism and, improving the lives of autistic people. So I think this is something to really closely watch. Okay, so conclusion. So after 4 years of living with chronic illness, I just accepted that I was always going to be a little bit sick. And I made peace with that. I learned to kind of shoulder that burden to keep looking forward with life, and I learned how to just be grateful for the things that I have. So once I actually figured out what was making me sick, I've just had a profound sense of gratitude because it honestly just feels like a massive blessing. Like, I accepted I was going to be sick, and now I don't like, my life doesn't have to look like that anymore. And I know that a lot of people don't get that blessing. A lot of people don't get better with the things that they struggle with. And so, even though this has all been really, really hard, like moving house is stressful, realizing that a lot of your illness was caused by other people's incompetence is annoying. But I can't even think like that because I'm honestly just so grateful that I'm better and that I'm getting better and that I've figured it out.
This is what chronic fatigue at 28 looks like. Oh, I wasn't particularly feeling sick. I was feeling down, but then I started having a coughing fit over here. And then I've been throwing up. It almost kind of feels emotional. I haven't thrown up before. I don't feel sick other than that, like usual. I have to fill both of these huge containers with piss. 24-hour sample each. One has acid, one doesn't, to test my urine for anything for the endocrinologist. Haven't done anything today. I've laid here all day, just no motivation, but it honestly feels a bit like depressive energy rather than fatigue today. So yeah. So I did this guided meditation, and it was like unshelving all these layers of clothing as if it's like these things that you're leaving behind and walk into the light. And I do feel like that helps me see like hope and light and things like that, like the things I'm trying to manifest, like good health and just happiness. But I think I was always looking at light, and I think I'm realising now that a lot of that light was false. So I kind of feel like I'm hitting this turning point where I'm kind of laying on the ground and realising that a lot of that hope I was chasing is false. And I feel like I'm kind of turning, which is good. I feel like I'm going up again. I feel like I'm going to be happy again soon. And I feel like I'll heal, but I feel like I've had to hit this rock bottom first and realise that there was no hope. And then kind of change my life view and my world view and things like that, and let go of some things. So I have faith I'll get better soon.